all, the following series of videos is going to be from Illinois State University's English Department's Press Play and Tune In series. It's going to include a bunch of clips from an interview between Dr. Woods and Dr. Schering about their experiences either creating and maintaining a podcast or teaching podcasts.
I figured I could start us off by going over some brief bios for the two speakers, Dr. Schering and Dr. Woods, and then I would give them each the floor for a little while to talk about maybe their podcast, maybe some useful things that they want to make sure that we know about. And then after that, we'll jump into some Q&A. I have a few questions prepared, and then we'll open the floor so that if anyone else has any additional questions, they're welcome to it. So I'm actually going to start with Matt, since I know we heard a little bit from Charles last time. I hope that's all right with both of you. So Dr. Matthew Schering completed his PhD at Illinois State University in the summer of 2022, and he's currently a member of the specialized faculty in the English department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Schering's research is focused on the intersection of contract grading and multimodal and digital writing assessments. He's presented his research at multiple national conferences, including the 4Cs and NCTE, and is currently in the process of writing a piece on spatial rhetoric and podcasting pedagogy. And then our second speaker, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you both just to get us started, is Dr. Charles Woods. So Charles Woods is an assistant professor of English at Texas A&M University Commerce, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in rhetoric, composition, and technical communication. His research interests include digital rhetorics, privacy and surveillance studies, and podcasting. In 2018, he launched the Big Rhetorical Podcast. For his work on the Big Rhetorical Podcast, he won the 2020 Kairos Service Award for graduate students, the 2022 Michelle Kendrick Outstanding Digital Production / Scholarship Award presented by Computers and Composition, and the 2022 John Lovis Award presented by Kairos, which honors contributions to the legitimatization of academic knowledge sharing through using digital tools. His newest project, the DRP Collective, was awarded an NCTE CCC Emergent Research Grant in 2023, and his most recent piece, the first podcast review manuscript in the field of rhetoric and composition, is available in the most recent issue of Computers and Composition. So those are our two speakers.
My name is Dr. Matthew Schering. Thank you for that introduction, Tiffany. Appreciate that. And my talk today is going to focus on some of the pedagogical implications of teaching podcasting as an assignment. So throughout this talk today, I'll talk about some of the benefits of podcasting, some things you want to keep in mind as you're building and designing and teaching these units. And I'll talk a little bit about just my personal experience, things I've learned writing and researching about podcasts throughout the early course of my career. So yeah, to get things started, I just want to talk a little bit about my history using podcasts and digital and multimodal writing in general. So my research started with my master's thesis that looked at various multimodal and digital writing projects like podcasts and wikis and visual essays and the sort of pedagogical ideologies we need to keep in mind as we're building those assignments and how they differ from more traditional conventional writing assignments. And building off of that with the work I did at ISU, I was interested in writing assessment, especially with an emphasis on multimodal and digital writing, which I think is an important consideration, which I'll talk a little bit about assessment towards the end of this talk and some things specific to ISU, like uptake and how that factors into teaching of podcasts. In addition to my academic work, I was also the original co-host of the Big Rhetorical Podcast with the esteemed Dr. Charles Woods, who is here today. Started that back in 2018. And in addition to that work, I've also taught podcasts in multiple courses. I've taught them at 101, 145, 145.13 at Illinois State, and I've had success in all of those courses with various podcasting assignments. So yeah, to get started from there, to transition a little bit, I'll talk about why I like podcasts, what kind of benefits it can have. So first off, I like podcasts because they're a very versatile assignment. So depending on what kind of learning goals you're trying to reach, there's a way to fit podcasts into a whole bunch of different styles, courses, and things of that nature. So one of the things I really liked in terms of how I taught podcasts was looking at it as an opportunity to let my students explore potential careers through professional interviews. And this is something I found really helpful, especially when teaching 14513. A lot of the students I had in those classes were freshmen, sophomore, early students who had an idea that they wanted to major in business, but weren't explicitly sure in terms of what way they wanted to go, what kind of career they wanted to pursue. So using a podcasting assignment framed as a professional interview was something that they really appreciated. It let them get some professional experience to see what a day in the life of somebody who is a marketing professional or a business administrator. It helped them see what that career was like and help them create a connection to do a little bit of networking as well. And it was just a really versatile assignment in terms of helping students think about really practical research questions. So they were able to think about, okay, this is a career I'm interested in. What are some of the things I need to know so I can make an informed decision whether or not I want to pursue this career or pursue this major any further? And that's something I think students really appreciated. I had a lot of students find out some really interesting things about their career. I've also had a handful of students who did that assignment like, you know what, I don't think I want to do this anymore, which I think the students really appreciated because it gave them a lot of perspective. And it also helped them articulate research questions that were really important to them, which is a skill that's going to be super important outside of business writing and just across the curriculum as well. So that's something I always got a lot of positive feedback from in terms of my students. Another really versatile way to frame this assignment is if you're doing argumentative essays, persuasive, dissuasive essays, kind of as a point counterpoint argumentative essay. This really helps students think about writing at the higher academic level. So kind of going beyond the high school ideology where you have a topic you're arguing for and it's just collecting a bunch of facts or this is my stance, I believe it for this reason, this reason, this reason. When we're thinking rhetorically, those kind of arguments don't exist like that. Thinking back to Bitzer, the rhetorical situation, and specifically that rhetorical audience, there's a group of people that you're able to influence, and that's what you need to emphasize. And when they're engaging in those actual conversations, trying to make decisions, they're not just listening to one side, other people have things to say. And this is an opportunity to teach that argumentative writing style, also to teach counter arguments, why those matter, how you can address those in your own writing. And it takes that out of the abstract academic writing and into something that they might see, something they might seem as more usable. That's something that's really important to me as an instructor, to not just bombard students with abstract theory, but show them, okay, this is how this manifests in your day-to-day lives. This is why the stuff we're talking about matters just beyond this writing course. And another benefit to podcasts in terms of being a versatile assignment is they're useful for exploratory writing, journaling. If you are big on doing pre-writing with your class, it's something I've found a lot of success with. And even just from my own writing, a lot of times I'll have an idea in my head. I think, okay, this is a great idea for a journal article or something, and it'll be really perfect in my head. And then as I try to write, it's like, oh, this is just not working. So having that chance to like verbally articulate what it is I'm interested in writing sometimes helps clarify and give me more direction. That's something I've seen with students as well, just using podcasting as a really casual opportunity for them to talk freely about things that they might be interested in exploring further. So I could go on and on about how podcasts could be used in a bunch of different assignments, but transitioning from that, also talk about how there are just also super useful assignments. So I've taught at 5 or 6 different colleges, and requirements for multimodal writing is something I've seen at every institution I've been at. And podcasting gives us a really useful way to meet that requirement. It's a really useful tool if you're doing some kind of genre remediation, which is something I've done the last few years while I have students write a persuasive essay and then remediate that into a podcast. Gives them the opportunity to see how different modes and media change the way we approach writing, change the way we deal with writing in these different contexts. And it's also a useful assignment to talk about ideas of spatial rhetoric. And this is something that can be difficult and super abstract for students to grasp. And when I'm teaching podcasts, I spend a lot of time talking about how spaces can be rhetorical and why that's something we need to think about. So this was inspired by uh, Thomas Rickert. And when I was doing my master's, we read his text, Ambient Rhetoric, and he talks a lot about this concept of Cora. And Rickert notes that Plato's Cora is an ancient attempt to think about the relation between matter and activity, work and space, background and meaning. And thus, it already starts to broach issues concerning relations among bodies, minds, and worlds. So for Rickert, physical space and place has a strong influence on our work and is a subtle yet pivotal piece of any rhetorical situation. So much like exigence, audience, constraints, or kairos, Cora or space is something we need to be considering as we're putting together our pieces of rhetorical suasion. So where we choose to present our material, where we choose to interact with our audience can and will change the ultimate quality of our products. And this is something that's really, really important with podcasts. And I'll get into that in a second. So, well, the idea of core, while the idea of space and place might be kind of abstract for students, I think framing it in this perspective, and Rickert also gives a really good example in terms of a coffee shop where he says, if I say a coffee shop is rhetorical, I do not simply mean that suasion emerges from a coffee shop's design choices, colors, layout, lighting, menu, and so forth, nor is the rhetorical simply their assemblage. Rather, to understand how the coffee shop is rhetoric, we have to understand the way in which this ensemble of elements is given as to affect or transform how we inhabit this space. So thinking about the rhetorical quality of spaces, where we're recording, where we're interviewing people, is something that comes up a lot when I teach podcasts. And it's also a really interesting way to talk about this kind of abstract concept. And I usually get a lot of good feedback from students. So when I have students go out and actually occupy physical spaces, write about how they are rhetorical, what kind of power they have. One of the common places that come up is the fourth floor in Milner Library, the quiet floor, and we talk about why that might not be a great place to record a podcast with it being a quiet floor. So you're probably going to get some unkind glances from librarians if you're there setting up microphones and having extended conversations. Um, and another thing that comes up a lot frequently is students talking about, okay, I want to interview someone in a professional setting, and while a college dorm room might be really comfortable for them, if you're in your 40s or 50s and established as a professional, going to a dorm room might not be the super comfortable place for that person to record a podcast. So these are the kind of unique insights where I can see students thinking about why space matters and how that can affect the rhetorical quality of their podcast. So that's just another interesting way, another way to think about multimodality with podcasts. And another interesting way that podcasts kind of help us think about writing is just the different ways we speak. So a big part of teaching podcasts is also teaching the affordances and limitations of that specific genre. So thinking about how media and technology change the way we write is critical for our writing courses. And this is something that Clara Lookwhite talks about when she notes that multimodal composition is not simply an extension of traditional composition. We can't simply overlay traditional frameworks onto composing with multiple modes. So with podcasting, we're changing just about everything in terms of how we present information, how we prepare information. So if you were to do a podcast on something you wrote a research paper on, you can't just copy and paste that and just record it just completely front to back, just reading an essay. That's not what an audience would expect from the specific genre of podcasting or that specific medium. So it's also an important way to think about, okay, the ways we write, the ways we speak, those are two very different things, and kind of podcasting gives us an opportunity to see just how that plays out in our own work. So there's a lot of good benefits to podcasting, but I want to transition now and talk about some tips for teaching podcasts. So one of the things that I found really useful when teaching podcasting is making use of rhetorical genre studies. So having students break down podcasts, this is a big part of the 101 pedagogy here at ISU. And this is something that gets them engaged, also gets them kind of excited because they get to break down some podcasts that they themselves listen to, think about how they're structured. Other ways to interject rhetorical genre studies is just having them also break down public speakers, again, with the speaking versus writing breakdown we have with a podcast. So using rhetorical genre studies throughout a unit is a good way to expose students to the necessary changes they need to make to their own approaches to writing. And another tip is just make sure you're leaving time for tech demos. So learning the mechanics of podcasting does take some time. So making sure you have time set aside in your classes to make sure students are on the same page, that they understand how the technology works. And that's something I've done every time I've taught podcasts. I have a tutorial I put together for working with Audacity, one of the free programs you can use. I also have some videos showing that if students are more visual learners. And that's an important step to take because technology is something that's important. And when we're creating podcasts, what we need to think about is accessibility as well. So um, over the course of my dissertation, I spent a lot of time researching technology and access to technology. So with podcasts, we can't just assume all students have uniform experience with technology. So um, yeah, technology and access to technology is an integral part of our lives. And a large majority of Americans do have access to technology, but it's far from universal. So there's this idea of the digital native that I think is starting to die down a little bit, but not everybody has the same experiences or access with technology. So while conducting research for my dissertation, I found several sources that outline stark discrepancies in terms of access to technology. So for example, the State Education Technology Directors Association found that in 2019, 17% of all teenagers did not have reliable access to a device. Gerald Dusky in 2020 found that 10% of college students lack access to a laptop to complete their homework. And the gaps in access to technology are unsurprisingly more prevalent in marginalized student populations as poor, rural, and BIPOC populations lag behind in terms of access. So according to Pew in 2021, whereas 80% of white adults have access to internet at home, the rate drops significantly for Black households at 71% and Hispanics at 65%. And these statistics are important to keep in mind as even in the most ideal situations, there were still a significant number of our students are probably going to come in without a lot of experience or access to technology. And finally, Pew in 2021 found that 28% of US adults aged 18 to 29 are smartphone dependent, meaning they have access to a smartphone, but are lacking access otherwise. So while access through a smartphone is better than the alternative, smartphones are far from ideal for completing projects like podcasting or other digital and multimodal projects. Um, and these technological gaps can be particularly dangerous if our assignments and assessment practices mistakenly assume that there is universal access or that all our students have similar experiences or access to technology. As I mentioned with some of the statistics, a sizable number of our students, especially rural students and students of color, come into our courses without significant exposure to or access to technology. And by making technological assumptions, we can easily fall into some traps that subconsciously uphold problematic teaching practices that reward students simply for coming from a privileged background that provided access throughout their lives. So with that said, I'm not going to try to scare people away from doing podcasts because there are a lot of great resources through ISU that can be useful to help bridge some of these access gaps. And Milner Library actually has a lot of good resources, which is something I looked into before I started teaching podcasts at ISU. I wanted to make sure that there were tools and resources available for students. Um, so yeah, as an instructor, one of the things that's important to me is to make sure that I'm not adding to the financial burden that students are facing. College is already super, super expensive. So to teach projects that require students to go buy expensive equipment or programs is not something I'm interested in doing. So for podcast assignments, there's a lot of good tools available. One of the things I use with my classes is Audacity, which is a free download. Also Adobe Edition through the students ILSTU. They should have access to Adobe. They did when I was there. I don't know if anything's changed in the year or so since then. So in addition to those actual programs for recording podcasts, Milner also has a lot of really useful tools as well. So through the Milner Library, students are able to check out laptops, a bunch of microphones, USB microphones, lapel microphones, digital voice recorders. So students have a lot of tools available to them that they can check out through the library with their ID cards. And also, additionally, the 213B labs in Milner have computers that are already loaded with Audacity, so students can go use those computers so they don't have to download any software. Some students have concerns with that, which is warranted, like to ask students like, hey, download this software. Some people might not necessarily be interested in that. So there are a lot of tools available to instructors through Milner Library. So it's important to keep that in mind and know that there is a lot of support out there if you want to make sure your class has access to the technology they need. So, and the last thing I want to talk about briefly is assessment, and specifically uptake, because uptake is a big part of the curriculum at ISU. So while completing my internship class, I read a piece by Silseth and Gilji. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so apologies to the authors. And something that really stuck with me is when they noted that students, when dealing with assignments that involve multimodal composition, can be skeptical about investing time and effort into producing these types of texts if they're not integrated thoroughly into the assessment practice. And that was one of those aha moments I had, because I had taught podcasts a few times before then. And when it came time to administer uptake, I would usually just have students do some writing on that. And if we're teaching students that podcasts have a lot of rhetorical value, if it's something that can be useful to them, to go from there and just have students do written uptake kind of sends mixed messages about the utility of podcasting or any kind of multimodal and digital assignment. So if you are engaging in these, I would highly suggest making sure that the assessment you use for uptake matches the project itself. So having students do maybe a second episode of the podcast where they briefly talk about some of their experiences putting it together, or maybe focusing it on podcasting as kind of like a little mini vlog where they also talk about their approach to completing an assignment, shows that the tools they use for podcasting is appreciated throughout the entire assessment process. So you're not saying, okay, do this podcast, but also write about it at the end, because writing is the most important mode of communication. That's not really the message we want to send with this. So that's something I've really taken to heart and made sure to make sure that the assessment projects I have at the end of major units match the work that students have done in the unit itself. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the approaches I take to teaching podcasts. I also have a bunch of references and resources here. I also have a handout I use and a module for teaching with Audacity that I've used in the past that has helped students understand the mechanics of it. I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested. So thank you. That is my talk. So we'll throw it back to Tiffany. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schering. I really like how you kind of draw our attention to maybe some of the more pedagogical choices that we're making, as well as how space and those types of things are really important and not necessarily something that I would have intuitively thought about. I will definitely be reaching out to you about those resources. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah,
I'm going to go ahead and switch. Awesome. Thank you. Oh, I did also want to add one other thing. Since your time here, we've also added a podcasting lab. So that's another resource for folks that are doing podcasting, 413L.
Matt, that was awesome. Particularly the breakdown of how like podcasts are both versatile and useful. I love the idea of having like a podcast as framed as like a business assignment. That's really smart. Also, agree with your comments about access. It's not just having the technology, but it's knowing how to use it. As you all know, Dr. Charles Woods, I'm assistant professor of English at Texas A&M University Commerce. And my email address and Twitter information and associated email addresses for the Big Rhetorical podcast are listed on the slide. You can reach out to me if you'd like to follow up about podcasting or anything I'm doing with the Big Rhetorical podcast via email, charles.woods@tamuc.edu, or the Big Rhetorical podcast.weebly.com. And follow the podcast on Twitter at The Big Ret, and follow me on Twitter at CharlesWoods1. So when I thought about coming and talking a little bit about the topic today, like becoming a podcaster, I'm obviously somewhat to the detriment of what it means to be a podcaster, I guess, thought about this for chronologically. The first thing was like, when did I really kind of get interested in podcasts and podcasting? And so Matt approached this from like a pedagogical perspective, but also a podcast perspective. I'm going to focus less on the pedagogical and focus more on the podcast. In like 2014, Serial published their first podcast about Adnan Syed. And that's kind of the first time I heard about podcasts and podcasting. I was working as a librarian in Alabama. And people were like talking about this thing. I was like, what is this? Okay, so I started listening, and then I started using podcasting as a way to communicate with friends. Now, specifically, the way I thought about this was that podcasts are kind of like my connection, or I'm tethering myself to new media and popular culture studies through the podcast early on, thinking about, because podcasts they have a lot of potential, and I was writing recently that they kind of exist in this like across the fields of entertainment and the academy, right? And so that's kind of where I was interested in, and made my entryway through the podcast S-Town, which has impacted me a great deal. I was excited to teach it for the first time last semester as a text in a narrative writing of nonfiction writing course, or maybe just nonfiction writing course, maybe not the word narrative there. Anyway, and we looked at this podcast S-Town, which was a serial production that came out in 2017. And the reason it affected me so much, I think, is pretty simple. Like, I grew up like 20 minutes from where the podcast took place. Like, I was in the suburbs of Birmingham, and this podcast S-Town that told the story of John B. McLemore was just 20 or 30 minutes farther out, right, than I was, into the rural West Alabama. And so that's kind of where I got into podcasts, thinking about them as new media and popular culture texts. And then in 2018, and I was telling the story yesterday in Stevenson is the way I can tell the story, because I don't know the room numbers apparently. But Matt Schering and I created the Big Rhetorical Podcast at ISU, and we did 8 or 9 episodes, and then we moved on different directions in podcasting, Matt towards the pedagogical side and me towards the production side. And I began presenting and research side, and I began presenting and publishing on podcasts and podcasting. And this has come in the form of workshops, panels, and things, and conference panels, things like that. My first publication in graduate school was actually on when I was in graduate school was actually on podcasts. It was in 2019 with ISU alums Courtney Cox, who many of you know, and Devin Ralston. It was on true crime podcasts and podcasting in like a conference proceedings journal for the conference Computers and Writing, which is an incredible conference in my area, in my field. And then now we've kind of moved forward to 2023. I've got a couple of things coming out that wasn't, like Tiffany mentioned in the bio, a publication in Computers and Composition. That's a review manuscript that's working to legitimize podcasts and podcasting scholarship, podcasts as scholarship in the field through connecting it to values. And that is co-written piece with another podcaster, Shane Wood, who does the podcast Pedagogue. And I mentioned that because it's important to think about podcasts as creating community, and you have to engage in the community and be a part of the community. And so that really works well for co-authoring, which, as we also know, in rhetoric is valued in rhetoric and composition. And then I've got a forthcoming piece in Patho that talks a bit about podcasts, that talks about how to go about researching and creating podcasts that serve the field of rhetoric and composition, tying those to feminist research methods, and etc. I'm going to kind of move on so we don't have to talk so much about that, but we can definitely take questions about it as well. I talked a bit about that yesterday. But I was writing recently on that piece during the revision process, and it kind of works here. Podcasts maintain the potential to shift the ecosystem of scholarship so that new forms of thinking become possible. And this comes from Hannah McGregor and her work, Podcasting as Feminist Method. This is an incredible scholar that we all should take note of and be citing in our work when it comes to podcasts and podcasting, I think. And this is how I think about podcasting when I thought about what the big rhetorical podcast could be in terms of shifting from talking about pedagogy to performing interviews, it was like making that intervention into the larger ecosystem of rhetoric and composition scholarship and changing the modality and perhaps reaching new audiences, those that both are public and academic. So this is really a guiding way that I think about podcasts and podcasting, and I wanted to share it with you all. It's just a short quote. So a little bit about developing the big rhetorical podcast. I'm going to move quickly here, but I'm going to elaborate in certain areas. So in the beginning, Matt and I were in the room across from the English office in Stevenson, discussing innovative writing studies, pedagogy, and focusing on experiences implementing technology in the classroom. And this was exciting. But then we took a new approach we kind of went in different directions, and I established an emerging scholar series to amplify the work of graduate students. So through podcast, as a graduate student, as a part of that community, I use podcasts to kind of serve and give back to that community. As I kind of thought about new directions the podcast could take, I established relationships with academic presses to filter new titles for podcast interviews. And then expanding the scope over time, I've worked to think about how to continue to give back and make this worthwhile. So I established a nonprofit organization which raises money and gives money to graduate students. These are incredible graduate students, by the way. Our recent award winner was her name is Elena Kalodner Martin. She does incredible work in rhetoric composition and the rhetoric of health and medicine. She's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so what we do is we we get nominations, and then I'm not out here judging alone. That's what's so cool. I usually reach out to folks who are at the assistant professor level and need a service line on the CV and ask two of them to be the judges for the nominees. The few years I've done this, I think the most I got was 12, and most is about that, close to that every year. And so that's another way to help out. And then we created the TBR Fellowship, which gives graduate students the opportunity to work on the podcast. The first fellow was incredible. His name was Michael Benjamin. He was at the University of Louisville. And so they get a little bit of money to work on the podcast. It's never enough money, right? We know that. It's never enough money in the humanities. But I modeled these fellowships and awards after the Computers and Composition Digital Press, which is a leading digital project and press in my field. So that's how I was trying to build ethos. And our newest TBR fellow is a guy named Hamza Ahmad at the University of Washington, who's doing incredible work in race and rhetorics and rhetorical studies. And then the newest thing, as I continue to expand the scope of the podcast, is to work with undergraduate students, which is a little intimidating at first, but working with graduate students in business communications and in technical communication to think about how the podcast presents itself in digital spaces, how to expand its footprint and reach new audiences, and also one-on-one work with a specific intern who is working on social media and accessibility issues and things with the podcast and stuff like that. So that's kind of where we are there. So researching podcasts and podcasting. Here, this is a quote that's kind of guiding the directions, the futures of podcasts and podcasting in the academy. This comes from Research in Digital Writing and Rhetoric, a new 2-volume collection edited by Crystal Van Kooten and Victor Del Hierro. The prevalence of the digital and rhetoric and writing affects the questions we ask, the methods we use to answer these questions, and the knowledge we make and the teaching practices we employ. So if you walk through this quote, right, the questions we ask, the methods we use to answer these questions, the knowledge we make, and the teaching practices we employ, we can see that this is related to both research and teaching. And this provides a framework for performing podcast research in the future. So what are some future podcasting projects that I'm working on to kind of continue being a podcaster, which was kind of the theme here today. I'm continuing to continue applications for awards recognition and grant funding. I've got a handful of awards well, not a handful, 3 awards under my belt from that Tiffany ran through in her gracious introduction. But I've also got other award applications out there. Like, I don't mind telling you that I'm hoping to be competitive and win an award from the community. Oh shoot, I should know the organization, but with rhetoric and composition, everything has an acronym and it's very confusing. But the Coalition of Community Writers, I think that's what it's called. Anyway, and then continue to work towards grant funding for this project. And that comes in multiple forms. That means creating a competitive application for a institutional grant from my university for scholars before their 3rd year review, right? That means seeking out organizational grants in our field. Like, for example, I missed the deadline on a CPTSC grant last fall that I'm still kicking myself over, right? But we have working to identify these things, win some awards to continue the legitimization of the knowledge that we're making through podcasting, and grant funding is important. The next thing is rewriting tenure and promotion guidelines to imagine podcasts as research and as a legitimate academic discourse. So I put together an entire podcast episode about this topic specifically. I should take that back. It wasn't about this topic specifically, but one of the questions that I knew I wanted to ask this person that I interviewed, Dr. Alexandra Hidalgo, was about how to integrate the value of digital scholarship into tenure and promotion guidelines. Dr. Hidalgo is a filmmaker working in rhetoric and composition in the Crow's Chair of English at University of Pittsburgh. And so that's one thing that we're working towards, and that a lot of, I hope that all universities figure out a way to think about digital scholarship there. And that's something that we're currently doing at my institution right now. It's exciting. I've got an email in my inbox that I need to go to, don't we all, and go to a Google Doc and look at our tenure promotion guidelines and offer some feedback on how we can do that, as they're up for, I guess they're always up for renewal, but we can renew ours this year, or revise ours this year. And then finally, I'm working on a book project about TBR. So one of the things that I wanted to do was write a book. And when I got out of the program at ISU, I moved to a teaching role, a non-tenure track role, a 4-4. And so that wasn't a part of what I had to do there. So I wasn't on my mind, but I'm coming back to it. And the first book about podcasts and podcasting came out earlier this year. Shane Wood, my co-author on the earlier piece, his book, Teachers Talking Writing, chronicles the development of his podcast and connects it to ongoing issues across higher education by focusing on writing in HBCUs and 2-year institutions, at 4-year institutions. My project is a bit different because the goals of my podcast have been quite different. What I see as my podcast doing is contributing to the narrative, of the field, right? So taking up this idea of storing the field is one of the frameworks I'm looking at. The idea of amplifying voices, and this is like, we can connect this to like using the proximity to power thing. That's important. But also, creating a space for graduate students to talk about their work is incredibly valuable when we think about deconstructing the hierarchy of, academia and digital publishing and the precarity of graduate students. And so that was like one of the things I was really wanted to do. And then finally, extending podcasting in higher education. It's time to write about what we're doing behind the scenes, developing internship programs, working with graduate students, establishing nonprofit learning the structures of the different nonprofit organizational options, right? And wherever it might be, that's what it means to be a podcaster. And so many people may not be thinking about that. My argument in the new piece in Patho is more than a single sound file. A podcast is more than a single sound file. It's so much more than that. So I wanted to share this with you. This is a picture from 2017, 2018. If you can see it, of me in that room with Matt across the hall in Stevenson with our early microphone set up, producing early episodes of the Big Rhetorical Podcast. Obviously, taking a break for some Mountain Dew in that picture. And then here we are 5 years later with the awards that I won at Computers and Writing over the last 3 years. Because of COVID, they hadn't been able to award them. So I felt like kind of very embarrassed, frankly, but it was a very poignant moment to capstone the hard work that's gone into becoming a podcaster. And with that, I think we can move on to a larger discussion. Thanks for having me.
So I have a question for both of you that I wanted to start with. And that's, what do you enjoy most or find most fulfilling about podcasting?
I think from a pedagogical perspective, it's one of those projects that students just really enjoy doing, and it's something they can really sink their teeth into. So when you get that kind of buy-in from students, that's when you get the really, really good writing, really good teachable moments. And again, it's something that can be super productive and practical for them, especially if you're doing it as like a personal interview or a potential occupational interview. So yeah, and it's just fun to do. It gives students an opportunity to get creative. Something I do is spend some time, especially when we're doing genre research, thinking about, okay, how can we use sound in a podcast? Like, what kind of sound effects can we use? How can we use transitions to make things a bit livelier? So yeah, it gives us an opportunity to have some fun, but also talk about some really serious implications in terms of the affordances of podcasts.
Thank you. Again, I like how you're kind of taking this from a pedagogical perspective, because I think that's something that, it's one thing to take it from like, okay, so this is how you do the thing. And then it's another thing to teach the thing, right? And then it's another thing to teach the thing and get buy-in, as you're kind of getting at there.
Yeah.
Dr. Woods, would you like to respond to that question? What you find most fulfilling?
Okay, I think that what I find most fulfilling is what I talked about earlier. And a lot of people will probably be like, oh, this is a great way to talk about knowledge circulation and collective knowledge making, and those things are important. Also, the mobility of podcasts. But for me personally, it's really about talking to people and doing interviews. I think when I was a kid, my brother, I think would get frustrated because we shared a room and I would like take over the remote when the late night shows would come on, and like watch these interview shows. And I think that maybe I enjoyed that. And in some way, those influenced what I'm doing in my research, which is really interesting to think about. And going back to that connection to like cinema and film studies, or what is it, new media and popular culture.
I was just going to interject. How many of us back in the day pretended we were being interviewed by Oprah? Right? Like,
Oh yeah.
I just remember going through days and being like, if I was on Oprah, Here's what I would say. So it's like there was a kind of culture happening of these like talk shows, interview shows. So yeah, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. I just was like, oh, I totally relate right there.
No, and that's important. I think it's an important connection to talk about because, and this isn't a secret, but like it kind of that kind of goes with academics having to like go and talk about their work and publicize their books, right? And stuff like that. So podcasts become a medium to do that without necessarily with video, right? It becomes a little bit.
And I think it's important too that you are able to contextualize the things that you're doing academically with that personal connection as well. So I really do love that. And it's something that makes your work relatable. So my second question for you both is what do you feel are the academic or intellectual differences between sharing research through podcasts versus sharing research through journal articles or academic books? So I know that you were kind of touching on that a little bit there, Dr. Woods, but that's where I'd like to take us next.
So if we're thinking about podcasts, especially like interview-based podcasts, I think it's a really good opportunity to use that as an opportunity to interact with a wider audience than just academics, because as academics we have certain genre conventions for like peer-reviewed journal articles. We need to be super precise with our language, and that's important, but it also can make things a bit inaccessible. So I think podcasts having maybe a bit more casual style allows us to engage with a wider audience, to share our research to a broader swath of the world, which as academics is something I think we should all be thinking about. Okay, how can the work I'm doing, how can that be useful on a bigger scale than just being published behind some paywall in an academic database somewhere. So I think that's a really good thing about what Charles is doing, is giving people an opportunity, especially grad students, an opportunity to share their work, maybe get that more exposed to people who are super into academics or even just into academic topics, but they're not in academia. Like a lot of the work Charles did with DNA testing, like that, there's a lot of scary real world implications with stuff like that. And even with stuff like Chat GPT, which is kind of a hot topic right now. People who haven't been in school in like decades might still be interested, like, what's this computer thing that like writes everything for us? And having an opportunity for an academic to come on a podcast and talk about something like that, I think is really valuable, especially with as technology is exponentially getting more and more powerful, and having an opportunity for academics to talk about stuff like that, or deep fakes or something that everybody in the world has a stake in. I think there's a really good opportunity there for podcasts.
The reason that podcasts work so well in rhetoric and composition, I think, is because they kind of like, this is going to sound so cliche, but like they like represent that parlor metaphor. You know what I mean? Like they really do. They create that space to insert yourself into the conversation at the right time. But so in rhetoric and composition, and we have a robust community of podcasters, right? Over a dozen substantiated podcasts. They're mostly interview based or conversation, right? For example, I'm talking to a guest every week, a graduate student, new author, scholar, activist. On TC Talk, the host Abigail Backey talks to her. She's a technical communicator, and her husband is an engineer, and they approach a different set of instructions or technological phenomenon, I don't know, in the episode from each disciplinary's perspective, right? Building the thing, teaching about the thing, right? Or communicating the thing. What we need more of, right, as we think about the next steps of podcasts as scholarship, and is to think about non-interview approaches. What does that look like? What topics are we choosing to cover in the podcast format, and what? And many of the topics that are covered are often related to social justice and things related, and all of those values, accessibility, inclusivity, coalition, right? And so that's kind of what I love podcasting. What I think about is what topics can we cover in rhetoric and composition that is an intentional choice to choose the podcast format. Podcasts are valued in the humanities, are valued in the social sciences. They're valued across disciplines, but at different degrees of value. And we need to think about that as well. You know, what we might be doing over in Stevenson Hall or in Talbot Hall, where I'm at, it might be very different than what they're doing in health and sciences with podcasts or business with podcasts. And I think that, again, Matt has created incredible ideas for merging those conversations. But the content we choose, and that can also go a great deal into merging academic and public discourse, right? The contents. And finally, the peer review process. That's the second thing. What does that look like? How do we establish that? What journals and multimodal or digital journals can we draw on to look towards to establish peer review standards for podcasts and podcasting? There is the content area, and then there's also the technological area to consider. And so that's kind of what my next project is. Hoping to continue to work with one of my collaborators. Matter of fact, we're meeting on the 21st. I'm excited about it. 2 weeks from today, I looked down at my calendar. To establish a peer-reviewed podcast journal, right? So a journal is a digital journal, and everything is a podcast, right? And I think that's going to be exciting. Where especially if our first journal series collaborator accepts us, it would be or agrees, it'd be a huge thing. So yeah, that's what I think I've got on that topic. A lot. Sorry, I rambled on.
I'm actually going to ask you to expand on it a little bit because we did have a question about peer review and what that process was like. So I'm going to ask two slightly different questions because I know that your focuses are a little bit different. So for Dr. Woods, have you had any peer review professionally with your podcast, and what has that looked like? And then for Dr. Schering, have you done any peer review teaching activities around your podcast? What might that look like, or anything kind of on that nature?
I'll go, and then Matt, you can finish up. No, my podcast has not been peer reviewed. There's been nothing associated with peer review in my podcast other than the podcast manuscript that I wrote was reviewed. It wasn't double blind peer reviewed. It was a podcast review manuscript. So like what the peer review process looks like is very much wide open. The thing that I would focus on specifically is that there isn't oversight. So this dozen podcasters that have created a community in rhetoric composition that I talk about are out here creating content, making meaning, creating platforms for emerging voices to talk about their work and establish important research trajectories for the field. We're doing all that stuff and we're not behind a paywall, which is the first thing, which is great. The second thing though is we're not bound to any standards or guidance like from an editorial review board, you know? And so I think that's the next step, right? And so we can think about this in two ways. Is it a podcast becoming a journal, or is it a journal that's a podcast? Okay. And so like what I want to create is a journal that is a podcast, and people submit audio scholarship. The other way is thinking about, well, if the big rhetorical was to pivot to a journal, who would I need to involve to create an editorial board for oversight and guidance as establishing a peer review process? So those are the two things I'm thinking about. I'm writing about right now, how there is a lack of editorial or peer review standards that for us out here doing podcasts and rhetoric and composition, and then that's a problem.
Yeah, and taking that a different route and thinking about peer review in a classroom setting, that's definitely something I do. But you can't do peer review for podcasting the same way you would for, like, say, a research paper, because you can't like have a peer review before a podcast is due, and then a student's like, oh, these are these questions you could consider. Go back and like redo the whole interview. There's no time for that. So, in terms of how I structure peer review, I break it down into a couple different sessions. So the first peer review session occurs before they actually go through and do the interview, where they have people look over their interview questions, look over their outlines, so they can get some feedback in terms of questions they might not have thought about, or ways to structure the questions so they get that nice conversational feel that they're looking for. And the second round of peer review, more immediately before an assignment is due, is kind of more usability testing, where students listen to each other's interviews and think, okay, how are you using audio rhetorically? Do you have like music that fits in terms of the content of your podcast? Are the levels relatively stable? And for that kind of stuff, I'm not obviously not looking for students to produce like a professional level quality podcast, but just to make sure they're cognizant, thinking about, okay, is there any way I could use some more kind of multimodal audio stuff to make this podcast like pop a little bit more, or get that sense of uh, ear candy, to use like a music production kind of term, to sweeten things, to make it a bit more like interesting and engaging for readers. So just kind of revisioning what peer review looks like given the context of the assignment. And obviously, if you're not doing like interview assignments, if you're doing more like a traditional research-based essay remediated into a podcast form, you have a bit more room to play around with in terms of how you structure peer review. But I try to break it up into a couple different sessions, just to try to cut down on a lot of the technical, mechanical work students might have to do at the end, like revising and re-editing like an entire podcast.
Awesome, thank you. And I agree, the way in which we teach podcasts, especially when it comes to that peer review process, can get a little bit messy. So I'm really grateful to hear you talk about that. And I'm also grateful to hear that there are steps being taken towards peer review processes for podcasts in academic settings too, because I think that is a relatively new thing to even be talked about, let alone now you're writing about it and doing something with it. So I know we've talked a lot about topics and ideas for podcasts, and now we're kind of talking about how podcasts might be different than journal articles or other texts that we would write or assign. So how do you think scholars should think about or pick topics to talk about through maybe a podcast setting versus through a more publication setting? And then similarly, if you want to talk about it in the pedagogy world, how do you kind of guide students through picking topics about podcasts versus things that they might do for other assignments?
So something that I've been interested in the last year or so is using single topics throughout an entire semester, and using the podcast as like a genre remediation activity. So that way students get to really focus in on the affordances and limitations of podcasting as a genre. So they're not worried about, okay, I need to do a whole nother round of research completely different from what I've already done. And that's an approach I think I found a lot of success with the last couple of semesters. Students enjoy that, and they get to really nuance that work and think about, okay, what kind of changes can I make in terms of speaking tone, or do I need to change the way I'm introducing sources in a podcast versus how I did it in the research paper I just wrote on this same topic. So, I mean, I've been teaching a lot of English 101 courses at U of I. So it's just an opportunity to really focus on the multimedia differences from genre to genre. So in terms of topics, I really have no issue with what students write about. I just think back to when I was teaching at a community college at the start of my career. I had one student trying to be a smart ass, raising his like, can I write a paper on Satanism? I'm like, yeah, go for it. And he actually did a really great job of that. So giving students freedom to write about whatever you want helps with that initial buy-in. Yeah, in terms of topics, generally for my class, like there's nothing like off the table in terms of that, and just encouraging students and spending some time like getting to know them and helping to push them in the right direction. So in terms of picking topics, I don't think there's really any wrong ways to go in terms of podcasting?
I agree with Matt. There's not a lot of wrong ways to go here, but I think that podcasts do lend themselves better to certain topics, as we've seen. Serial came out in 2014, and Adnan Syed was released from prison earlier this year. That's an incredibly long time. That's like 9 years, 8 or 9 years. But that's the power of what this type of text can do through its mobility and ability to reach various audiences. So when students are thinking, well, I want to talk about it from a teaching perspective too. Is that okay, Tiffany? When students are teaching, when students are choosing subjects, or I'm sorry, topics or subjects for a podcast, and when I'm thinking about subjects and for my own podcast too, I'm thinking about audience, okay, and content, okay. So when for the students, it's like, who is this podcast gonna reach? Okay. Is it a local audience that you want to reach? Are you engaging in larger conversations about a new movie or an social issue that's captivated the nation or something? It's important to think about how your podcast is going to exist among a network of other podcasts. And I talked briefly, like very briefly, I think yesterday I mentioned that, the second iteration of the podcast is the podcast network. Whether they are established networks around a certain topic, like related to sports or popular culture or politics, or we are still all networked, right? Even if it's not apparent. And so that's kind of something to think about in the classroom too. Like, if you have a business writing elective course with 18 students on it, that's 6 teams of 3, or 4 teams of 4, or whatever. Well, if they all chose topics related to business, now you can all create podcasts and produce and publish them together as individual group projects that exist within a larger podcast network that the class produces together. That's one of the earliest, well, not the earliest. That's one thing that I enjoyed doing when I was at ISU, publishing podcast networks with the 145 students and 145 students. Another thing is to think about the values of your field if you're producing or trying to produce an academic text. So I mentioned that podcasts work well for building coalition and leading social change. Well, those are values of rhetoric and composition. That's why it works so well. And then, yeah, I think that's what I've got to say there.
Awesome, thank you. So you mentioned networking, which is another thing that I wanted to talk about. So how do you network or decide who to ask to join your podcast? And then also thinking about it teaching wise, if you're teaching it, how do you talk with students about networking, or how might you talk with students about networking if it's something that you don't already do?
For the podcast TBR, I just go on Twitter. No, I'm joking. But Twitter, social media is a big place. People I know in the field. See, it's kind of like a snowball, right? You meet 5 people, then you meet that like multiplies, and it's 25 people and 100 people. And so that's what's been really nice, honestly, about developing the Big Rhetorical Podcast, is that I, like, in my field of rhetoric and composition, like, not the podcast and not me, but the work that I've done on the podcast exists in like the ether of like the central part of all the field. Like, I know all the different stuff that's going on, and it's super valuable, but it's also very overwhelming. So I use social media to do that. I develop networks and talk to people that way. So like the snowball thing, but also I've developed relationships with academic presses to send me, 3 or 4 books a year. That's what's so great, is that if I run out of desk copies as an instructor. I just email them from my podcast account, be like, hey, I want to have this author on the podcast. Will you send me the book? I don't have any funds to buy these books. I'm a grassroots podcaster. So I've developed relationships with 4 or 5 presses that specialize in different areas, right? And that's an important thing to think about too. Filter authors my way. Yeah. Also, can I mention one other thing before Matt starts? On location podcasting has been great for choosing people to be on the podcast. Matt and I did this for the first time together on the Big Rhetorical Podcast in 2018 at East Lansing, Michigan. And we, Michigan State University Computers and Writing Conference. We took our podcasting equipment to the bowling alley for bowling night at the conference and recorded a live episode. And we met people that way who then would come on and do a full episode later. And I've produced these live episodes in Indiana, Illinois, Alabama, Michigan, Texas. Yeah, no, not Texas. That's where, others. Anyway, all right, yeah, that's another thing. All right, sorry.
Yeah, so with a lot of my assignments, I try to leave the door open so students can continue to work on it outside of my class. And that's another reason why I let students write about whatever they want, so they have that kind of built-in interest. So they can continue beyond my course, maybe do some networking like Charles does, find some other people, other scholars interested in doing the same work, or people in the same job field doing similar things. So using that to organically grow their podcast in a way really similar to what Charles is doing, just at a non-academic level, for like maybe starting out with friends and then eventually like building that up to connections they make as they get into their upper level college level courses or into the professional world.
Awesome. Thank you. I think networking is something that's always very difficult. And so I think hearing about it and thinking about it is super helpful. So my next question is kind of thinking more about like your internal networks, thinking about how you got started in podcasting, who, if anyone, kind of helped you with that process. I know you both have a project that you started together. And then how did that process work? How did the folks that kind of helped you get started help you?
Well, it's weird because the answer to this question for me is Matt. And the answer to this question for Matt is me. Because we kind of started podcasting together at the same time. And that's what's been so like nice about, the way that this workshop and talk has developed, is that, this podcast was started at ISU by ISU students. And as it continues to gain steam, like that's something that shouldn't go unnoticed. And so that's why I've been thinking about coming back together with Matt and talking about this. Matt and I will work together on this. And so far it's developed, and we've had all kinds of like super award-winning filmmakers and Pulitzer Prize journalists and like New York Times best-selling authors. And so I owe all that to Matt, really, but who helped me get started as a podcaster. That's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, it started just me and Charles kind of looking for a way to build on the work we were doing in our grad level courses. And yeah, I mean, my exposure to like Audacity and sound editing beforehand kind of made things easier, and just kind of building in your networks, even areas outside of what your podcast is going to be about. Like all the stuff I learned about doing like basic sound editing was back when I was in a speed metal band before I came to ISU, but I was able to use those same skills and apply them in a different direction. So also just kind of being aware, like you never know where inspiration is. Yeah, that's right, Charles. Never knowing where your inspiration is going to come to, or what kind of outside interest you can do to expand the kind of work you're doing, or reapply it in different contexts and kind of remix things you've done outside of your main profession or field of study.
So my next question then is, how do you balance the work that you do for your podcast when you're making it, editing, networking, all of those various pieces that go into it, how do you kind of balance all of that with academic and life stuff? But then also when you're teaching it, how do you help your students with trying to find that balance?
Yeah, so balance is important, especially with podcasts. I have a lot of students kind of like, oh, that's a lot of work. I've never done that before. So there's that initial level of trepidation. But as I mentioned earlier, I have a little Audacity handout module that I do with students, and it's super intuitive, and it takes students about like 40-50 minutes to get through. So it's something like having that time in class, like I mentioned in my talk, just leaving time for tech demos and things like that. Students haven't had any issue with that aspect of it, and they get through it pretty quick and like, oh, that was actually easier than I expected. So doing that early in the podcast kind of helps build their confidence a little bit, so they're not freaking out about just the mechanics of working with that. And that's the same thing I do if I'm teaching like websites or something, to just taking the time in class early on in a unit. Okay, here's how this specific tool works. These are some resources you have. And again, I'm happy to share those with anyone who's interested.
I appreciate this question because as a podcaster and a scholar, I've had to work overtime to figure out how to integrate these two things together. And so that's ultimately the answer, right? I integrated podcasting into my research. So that helps, I was a mentor at East Carolina University where I did a pit stop before moving to Texas, who is actually, this is all about networking, who is actually an ISU alum, Will Banks, was talking to me about the value of creating something that you can write about, right, as scholarship. And so that's really something that I've really been foregrounding in my research trajectory as I approach putting together this book project. So I've integrated it. But the other thing I thought about was this theme of balance. And so one thing I wrote down way earlier from Matt's brilliant talk was that podcasts appear to be a genre which complement discussions or complement the balance between theory and practice in the classroom. Yeah, so I thought that was really cool, like to think about podcasts as, you can talk about them theoretically as digital text, as network text, as collective knowledge making, et cetera, whatever, theoretically, however you want to look at it theoretically. But there also is that practical application that's valuable for the student writer, for student readiness. And, in another life, I would look at, jobs in the podcasting industry and in media centers on the East and West Coast, because they're there and they're not going away. And so having our students to do this potentially do this is valuable.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think balancing time is very difficult. I know that I struggle with that, and I'm not even really doing anything academically that isn't like above and beyond like the podcasting stuff that you're doing. So I am definitely thinking about how important it is to get the tenure track approval and like at that as part of our actual research for the folks that are doing it. So the question that I want to ask now is, how do you think the content that gets used in a podcast affects what happens in the podcast, or how it comes together? The editorial process, what content, like how you organize it versus like how you produce it, the extra sounds that you add in, all of those elements.
Yeah, so in terms of like extra sounds or just production value kind of stuff, so when I'm teaching podcasts, I try to frame it, and this is kind of getting back to the balance thing, is like I tell my students, like, I'm not expecting you to do something as polished as some of the podcasts we're going to listen to in class. It's more about just understanding the concepts behind that. Okay, why are certain sound cues used in specific instances? What song are you using? Why are you using that specific song? And just thinking about, okay, how is this adding to the rhetorical quality of a piece? How is how are all of these pieces working together to help you deal with the exigency you have for just preparing this podcast. And just in general, as they're putting together like outlines and stuff, I just try to frame it like, just be curious. Like, don't go in there thinking, okay, these are the steps I want to take. I want to say this, and just be done with it. Just stoking the flames of that academic curiosity, having them look at the podcast like this is just one episode. Keep your mind open, and maybe if this is something you're super interested in, there's like 3 or 4 episodes that come after this, and if they never do another podcast, that's fine too, but just retain that certain level of curiosity and just kind of let the questions drive the content, and not just starting at the end with, okay, this is the thing I want to say, and just building it up that way. So just focusing it in that direction, I think, is a helpful way to frame podcasting assignments, and just any kind of multimodal assignment. Just focus on the content more than mastering the mechanics, because if they want to take a course where they learn how to like do a super polished podcast, there are other avenues for that. But for a like 145-13, it's like, okay, here are the skills, this is the concept, this is why we're working with this, and this is how you can use it effectively in this kind of constrained 4 or 5 week frame.
So since the discussion earlier about the lack of editorial standards, I think comes into play here. What I'm thinking is like, because, engaging in academic conversations and top level journals or tier 1 journals in your field, there might be and potentially usually are certain expectations about who to cite and why you cite them. Maybe. Well, here's an opportunity to be intentional, because there is that lack of oversight about who we cite and why. An opportunity to foreground potential voices and knowledge that's been either lost and can be recovered, or that isn't academic in nature. So there's that. Be intentional about who we cite and why. The next thing, I think that there should be conversations related to this about data collection and research. For example, I think about podcasting as research, right? Podcast as research, podcasting as a research method. So like, what if I record, what happens to the original file, right, of the audio production before it's edited and music and sounds are added? Is it destroyed? How does that connect to the standards of research in the humanities and social sciences beyond just podcasts, right? So that's an interesting question. For example, I was telling, I think Dr. Allison yesterday, I record via video, convert to MP3. So what happens to that video file, right? Well, I destroy it because it's huge and I don't want it on my computer. So a lot of times we're like following a lead. So if an author gives, or if a press gives me an author to interview, I have a responsibility to like read the bio, right, of that author, to make sure I'm not, amplifying the ideas of some, horrible person, right? So there's this idea of like, this is a research method, right? Reading those bios, or a practice, maybe, if you want to boil it down even further. And then ultimately, these are going to lead to larger conversations related to copyright. How are we using sounds? Who do we choose? Which sources do we go to choose sounds? If we're doing like a investigative journalist podcast, or framing an interview with sounds or media sounds or interviews, or voices from different outlets. I think those are larger conversations I'm leading to, so I'll start rambling.
How do you work to keep podcasting innovative? So we've been talking about podcasting since we all started at ISU way back, and people have been talking about teaching it and researching with it. But especially as the field becomes so kind of flooded, and trends have changed over the years, and students' reactions to them have changed. How do you work to kind of keep up with those trends changing and just keeping it relevant with what's going on now compared to like 2016, 2017?
I wrote in the comments, this is a good question because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. At one point, I think late last year, I was like, I'm tired of doing the big rhetorical podcast. I want to do something different. And the reality is I wasn't really tired of doing it. I was just wanting to do something different because I see the like different potentials in podcasting innovations, right? Like Brittany is talking about. This is a great question. The interview podcast, is it worn out? Maybe. I think so. Probably a lot of people think that. I would argue that in the field of rhetoric and composition, we had a moment as podcasters, and that moment is kind of like we're on the downhill of that moment, if you will. And so we have to figure out ways to be innovative and fresh. And I think that goes back to the topics that we choose. So in my field, what emerging topics are we talking about or covering? So I just went to the SEAS conference in Chicago. They had a special session on artificial intelligence. Well, maybe instead of an interview podcast, like we put together, the podcasters produce some other like feature podcast about artificial intelligence instead of just like talking to one person about it in an interview. I think that there's a lot of templates out there, like the Daily from the New York Times is a great model of podcasts which reach academic and public audiences. And so that's the other thing I would say, Brittany, is really to focus on how are we doing that? And are we doing it successfully? That's just a couple of thoughts that I have to a great question, but I'm going to let Matt talk now.
Yeah, so that, again, going back, I was at SEAS too, and just thinking about podcasting, like Charles has been doing long form interviews for a while now, but I think one of the more interesting parts about academic conferences is the big roundtables where you get a bunch of people together and they just have a conversation based on their own experiences, their own research. And I think that might be an interesting way to take the field, especially with new technological developments. I mentioned Chat GPT earlier. There was a session on that, which Charles was, you were at that session. Yeah, I think so. So using that and maybe also looking at it as a cross-disciplinary way to approach topics, maybe reaching out to people in bioethics or like a nice intersection for some like medical rhetoric work, just using it as an opportunity to maybe put voices in conversation with each other that wouldn't typically exist. So that might be one way to look at it, or to kind of expand what we think they are capable of doing. I don't know, it's a really, really good question, Brittany.
If I could ask a question, could you talk about the time commitment in constructing what you consider a good episode on a podcast? I think most of the people here know how much time it takes to write a good, article or a book. And I think, we sometimes assume new technology is cool, but there's a lot of time commitment here.
Can we tackle this question in this way? I'll talk a little bit about producing one, and then Matt, maybe you could talk about how you talk about this with the students in the classroom. I think that makes the most sense. So it is a time commitment, and it's a time commitment, and the least amount of time is actually talking to people for the interview. That lasts about 45 minutes. And so the things that I'm spending my time doing are writing what I call them bookends, like the intro and outro to frame the episode, to frame the interview, and recording that, creating graphics to promote the podcast online. So when a guest reaches out to me, I have like a templated email that I send over to them. Like, I need these things, right? Image, CV, short bio. So I take those things and make the promotional images, right? Booking, emailing, using, whatever web-based platform it is to coordinate meetings with larger groups. What Matt said about putting voices in conversation with each other who aren't, that's a great idea. Sometimes I've talked to large groups of authors on an edited collection, right? And stuff like that. That's podcasting. You know what I mean? That's what podcasting is. It's not just and then on top of all of that, that's before you even sit down in front of Audacity or GarageBand to begin working with the audio files. Things that have worked for me include creating instructions, which makes sense, I guess, for a technical communicator. So like, I know exactly what to do every Tuesday morning. Boom, hit this link, copy this from a Word doc, drop it in the Twitter. And then also on the other social media platforms, but also learning the functions of those social media platforms, right? Like maybe when I was early in Twitter, I didn't know you could like set a tweet to go off at this time. So I can schedule my social media posts. That's been a game changer. And on top of that, there's creating the transcripts. So that's hard work. And when we think about connecting transcript creation to research standards and transparently, I'm not meeting research standards with transcripts. I have a transcript. It's produced from the Zoom closed captioned thing. And then I go in and add what I've written to the beginning and the end. I've extended and I'm working with undergrads this semester. And so they're working on some editing of the podcasts. But so in terms of like how much time, it's impossible to think about it in a quantitative figure. Let me just tell you all the things I'm doing. And if you want to think it temporally, I would say 5 hours a week. That doesn't include an interview being recorded. So add 1 hour for each of those. But I think this is an important question because we also have to talk with our students about it. And when we design our curriculum and our assignments, it's not just like Matt said, it is what Matt said, displaying and demonstrating the technology, but also allowing time for troubleshooting, which is learning, right? And that's what our primary goal is in the classroom, I think.
Yeah, so when I'm teaching in general, I usually like to have my unit start out slow and then kind of ramp up a bit as it proceeds. But with podcasting, I kind of have to take the opposite effect or the opposite approach. And the first couple weeks are really, really super intense. I give them the Audacity module really early in a unit so they get used to the technology, and they have an opportunity to see, okay, these are some issues that I might have before anything is even recorded. Same thing with early class periods. Okay, let's break down what's going on in this podcast. How are the interview questions structured? So I also try to make sure that the podcasting unit I have is, if I'm doing 3 assignments over 16 weeks, make sure that there's more time in that podcasting unit just to give me the opportunity, maybe do some conference days with students, and being economical with your time, especially when you're working with technology. A lot of students might not have a lot of experience, and that is a big concern. So my research lately has been looking into using more flipped classroom days where maybe I'll post a lecture video like we all kind of made an experience with over the last few COVID years. So that way I'm able to use in-class time for a lot of that troubleshooting to help guide students through some of the mechanical stuff, which is probably going to be a lot scarier and the most difficult part that students have. So thinking about time like that, and just also really using this as an opportunity to have really good uptake assignments, because with podcasting, like in 4 or 5 weeks, students aren't going to get the skills they need to put on a polished thing like Charles does. So it's an opportunity for them to talk about, okay, here's what I learned about podcasting. This is what worked for my podcast. And this is, if I was going to continue this as my own show down the road, these are the kind of changes I would make. And keeping all that in mind as I'm assessing the project in and of itself. So yeah, it's kind of an intense unit, but at the same time, it's also something that students really have enjoyed doing in my courses. So I think it's worth the additional effort, and students get a lot out of it. So that's, I think, the important thing.
Yeah, I don't know if this is as much a question or just kind of amusing, but Dr. Sasita, as you're asking your question, I was thinking too of how, well, we're literature scholars. And so maybe what we would come to podcasting for would be a little different in structure sometimes than the interview. And I was thinking of the time commitment of like what another structure might look like. Charles, you'd mentioned being inspired by shows like S-Town early on, which I remember listening to that. And I remember thinking, like, as a literary scholar, I'm loving the unfolding of the story. And how could we as scholars bring that to some of the work we're doing in literary studies? Like, Jan, I'm thinking, of like Lewis Carroll, or for me, things about Daniel Defoe, things that are still mysteries, things that are still kind of riveting. Is there a way to turn those into a almost like true crime kind of structure? But oh my gosh, the work that would take in reimagining how to tell a historical or literary story, but segmented, talking to this person, now talking to this person, now having some little, I don't know, historical moment episode, or like, yeah, gripping, like how to make it gripping and suspenseful the whole time and divide it into episodes. And I was like, it sounds beautiful, but the amount of work that would take is kind of overwhelming. I mean, maybe the work it takes to do a journal article is also overwhelming, but we are so conditioned to do it that we just go straight to archival work, do this, here's my sources, my bibliography. So it's like completely rethinking how we could maybe structure our work that will have a huge learning curve that's time consuming until maybe we get really good at it. But yeah, I mean, Jan, some of the stuff that you work on lends itself so well to, like, people are curious about some of these authors and these texts and they want to know more. So the gripping part is kind of already there, but how much work does that take? Yeah.
When I was talking to the filmmaker Alexandra Hidalgo last year, she was talking about, what she wants to see academics do is to figure out a way to make their scholarship more gripping. And so that's why I put parentheses or quotation marks around that word. And I thought that was really like such a good idea, not just because she was a creative and a creative writer and a filmmaker, but all and writes novels. I mean, she's incredible. Alexandra Hidalgo, Agnes Films, y'all look her up. But what she was talking about gripping makes me think of how we merge audiences, public and academic. That's how we can get people more interested in the work that the humanities is doing, the work that social sciences is doing. We don't have to end this conversation on a sour note, reliving and thinking about the fight that the humanities is in for its place in higher education and in American culture. But podcasts can contribute to that, I think. And if they provide an avenue for gripping work, or a medium for gripping work that can merge academic and public discourse, and let public audiences know that the work of literature scholars, of rhetoric scholars, of humanists is valuable work and shouldn't be forgotten.